The fall from heaven time froze in that terrible moment. 8-year-old Jack Wittmann hung suspended in the air, his small body silhouetted against the magnificent stained glass window of Liberty Heights Cathedral. A heartbeat earlier, he'd been playing Amazing Grace on the grand piano for the children's charity event. Now, Beth Wittmann's scream tore through the cathedral's marble halls as her son plummeted from the third-floor balcony. The sound of her voice, primal, raw, with terror, silenced the crowd below, faces turned upward in horror. The arc of Jack's fall seemed to stretch into eternity, his blue Sunday suit fluttering like broken wings. Beth lunged forward, her hands outstretched in a futile gesture of protection, as if she could somehow catch him from 30 feet away. In the breathless silence between 1 second and the next, before his body struck the marble floor, everyone present understood the same terrible truth. A single moment can transform everything forever. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from. Now, let's continue with the story. Liberty Heights Cathedral stood as a monument to faith in the small town of Millfield. Built in 1897, its soaring spires and intricate stonework made it the crown jewel of the community. Inside, 3 tiers of balconies surrounded a central atrium with marble floors below and a magnificent dome above, from which hung a crystal chandelier that scattered light like diamond dust. On Sunday mornings, the cathedral wasn't just a place of worship, it was the heart of Millfield, hosting community events, charity functions, and offering outreach programs for those in need. Jack Wittmann, was the kind of child who turned heads, not just for his cherubic appearance, golden hair, and eyes so blue they reminded folks of summer skies, but for his extraordinary gift. His small fingers could coax melodies from the piano that seemed to carry the weight of emotions far beyond his 8 years. Each Sunday, the congregation fell silent when Jack played, many claiming they felt closer to heaven through his music. Jack had his father's talent and his mother's gentle spirit, a combination that endeared him to everyone who met him. Elizabeth Beth Wittmann had been raising Jack alone since her husband Robert died in military service 3 years earlier. At 34, Beth's soft features carried the subtle lines of someone who had known both joy and sorrow. As an ER nurse at Millfield General, she had seen the worst of humanity and the limits of medical science, yet maintained a quiet faith that good would prevail. Her colleagues marveled at her composure during the most chaotic traumas, never knowing how she wept alone at night, missing Robert and praying for strength to be both mother and father to their son. Dr. Thomas Reynolds, the cathedral's most generous benefactor, had his own history of loss. Approaching 60, his silver hair and commanding presence belied a wounded heart that had never fully healed after losing his teenage son to gang violence 20 years earlier. His wife, Catherine, noticed how he watched Jack with a mixture of affection and pain, seeing shadows of what might have been. As Millfield's most respected trauma surgeon, Thomas had dedicated his life to saving others after failing to save his own flesh and blood. Michael Daniels was invisible to most of Millfield, just another troubled veteran whose hollow eyes and muttered conversations with unseen companions caused people to cross the street when they saw him coming. At 32, his once strong body had grown gaunt, his mind fractured by experiences in combat and the schizophrenia that followed. 6 months earlier, he had found temporary solace in the cathedral's veterans program, but budget cuts had eliminated that lifeline, sending him back to the streets and the mercy of his demons. April 15th marked the annual Healing Hands charity event at Liberty Heights Cathedral, a tradition that brought together Millfield's most vulnerable children with those blessed with special talents. The cathedral's grand atrium had been transformed with pastel ribbons and bouquets of spring flowers, creating an atmosphere of celebration and hope. White chairs, arranged in neat rows, faced the gleaming grand piano positioned at the base of the central staircase. Even before the event began, the space hummed with anticipation. Beth Wittmann checked her watch as she hurried Jack through the cathedral's side entrance. Her scrubs were hidden beneath a simple blue dress, hastily changed into after her night shift at Millfield General. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, but her smile remained bright as she straightened Jack's bow tie. "Remember to take a bow after your piece," she whispered, smoothing his golden hair. and slow down on the bridge section. You rushed it during practice." Jack nodded solemnly. At 8, he approached his performances with a seriousness that sometimes made Beth's heart ache. Since Robert's death, music had become Jack's sanctuary, and Beth wondered if he played as much for his departed father as for any earthly audience. "Will Daddy hear me today?" Jack asked, eyes fixed on his polished shoes. Beth knelt before him, cupping his face in her hands. "Your daddy hears every note you play, sweetheart. He's so proud of you." Reverend Sarah Calloway approached. Her silver hair pulled back into a neat bun, her clerical collar stark against her black attire. At 61, she carried herself with a dignity born of surviving life's hardest trials while keeping faith intact. "Our young maestro is ready, I see," she said, placing a gentle hand on Jack's shoulder. "We've got a full house. The children from St. Augustine's home are especially excited. Some have never heard live piano music before." Beth's smile tightened slightly. "I'm glad the event wasn't affected by the recent, changes." The words hung between them, unfinished but understood. The cathedral's budget cuts had eliminated several outreach programs, including the veteran support group that Robert had once found solace in after his first tour. The Reverend's eyes dimmed momentarily. "Difficult decisions in difficult times, Beth, but we're doing our best with what we have." Beth merely nodded, unwilling to reopen old wounds on this day of all days. Jack needed her focused and present. Across the cathedral, through the main entrance, Michael Daniels slipped inside unnoticed. His weathered army jacket hung loose on his frame, his eyes darting around the ornate space as if mapping escape routes. The voices had been louder today, more insistent. They had guided him here, though he wasn't entirely sure why. Something about a message that needed delivering. "Sir, can I help you?" A young usher approached, hesitation in his step. Michael flinched, then forced a smile. Just here for the music." "I like music." The usher, clearly uncertain, nevertheless nodded toward the remaining seats. "It's about to begin. Please find a seat." Michael moved deeper into the cathedral, the voices growing louder as the space filled with people. The marble columns seemed to shift and breathe around him. He found a spot along the wall, partially obscured by a massive floral arrangement, and tried to quiet his mind. The event began with Reverend Calloway's welcome, her warm voice carrying to the cathedral's farthest corners. Beth sat in the front row, pride evident in every line of her body as Jack was introduced. The audience applauded as the small boy approached the piano, his blue suit making him appear like a miniature businessman. He climbed onto the bench, adjusted it slightly, and placed his hands above the keys, pausing as he always did, as if listening for some distant cue. Then he began to play. The first notes of Amazing Grace filled the cathedral, but transformed in ways that made the familiar hymn new again. Jack's interpretation was both innocent and profound, his small hands creating a conversation between melody and harmony that spoke of grace beyond understanding. Even the most restless children grew still, captivated by music that seemed to make the stained glass windows vibrate with color. Beth closed her eyes, allowing herself this moment of pure joy. Through Jack's music, she could almost feel Robert's presence beside her, his hand warm in hers. The night shifts, the struggling finances, the empty side of her bed. All receded as her son's gift filled the cathedral with beauty. Halfway through the performance, Michael began to move. The voices had become a roar now, drowning out even Jack's crystalline notes. They pulled him forward, step by hesitant step, toward the piano. No one paid him much attention at first, just another attendee, perhaps moving to get a better view. But as he approached the front, his movements becoming more erratic. Beth's eyes snapped open. She recognized something in his haunted expression, a ghost from her professional life. Hadn't she seen him in the ER several months back? A psych case. Paranoid delusions, the chart had said. Discharged after stabilization because there were no beds available in the mental health unit. Another face in the revolving door of the inadequately treated. "Excuse me," Michael said suddenly at the edge of the performance area, his voice cutting through Jack's music. "Excuse me, I need to—" Jack faltered, looking up from the keys with confusion. The music stuttered to a stop. Beth rose, maternal instinct propelling her forward. "Sir, perhaps you could wait until after the performance?" Their eyes met for one lucid moment. Michael seemed to recognize her. "Nurse? You're the nurse?" "Yes, that's right. Why don't we step outside and talk?" Beth kept her voice calm, just as she would with an agitated patient. You're fine," Michael said, nodding rapidly, but his eyes had shifted to Jack. "He's the one, the messenger. They told me." And before anyone could react, Michael lunged forward with unexpected speed. His hands grabbed Jack, lifting the boy bodily from the piano bench. Screams erupted from the audience as Michael, with strength fueled by delusion, carried Jack toward the staircase. "Stop, please." Beth's voice shattered with terror as she lunged after them. Dr. Reynolds jumped from his seat, moving with an agility that belied his age. "Someone stop him." But Michael was already ascending, Jack's small body struggling in his grasp. "I have to send the messenger," he kept repeating, his voice eerily calm amidst the chaos. "The voices say he'll deliver our message. To heaven." Beth raced up the stairs behind them, her heart threatening to burst from her chest. 2 security volunteers pursued as well, but Michael had the advantage of surprise and determination. He reached the 3rd-floor balcony, Jack still clutched in his arms. "Please," Beth begged, approaching slowly now, hands outstretched. "He's just a little boy." "My little boy." Something flickered in Michael's eyes. Doubt, perhaps, or a moment of clarity. Jack's terrified face turned toward his mother, tears streaming down his cheeks. "Mommy," he whimpered. Michael stepped back against the balcony railing. "The voices don't lie. They never lie." "Michael," Beth said, suddenly remembering, his name from the charts. "Michael Daniels, you don't want to do this." His eyes widened at the sound of his name. "How do you—" In that moment of distraction, Jack twisted violently in Michael's grasp. The movement caused Michael to stumble backward. His lower back hit the railing, and for one horrible second, both he and Jack teetered on the brink. Then Michael seemed to make a decision. With a powerful movement, he thrust Jack away from himself, perhaps intending to push the boy to safety on the balcony floor. But his aim was off, his judgment impaired. Instead of landing on the solid balcony, Jack's small body went over the railing into empty space. And the world stopped turning. The waiting room of Millfield General's Trauma Center was a place Beth Wittmann knew intimately, but always from the other side of the counter. For 6 hours she had sat rigid in a molded plastic chair, her scrub still partly visible beneath her blue dress, now stained with her son's blood. Her hands, usually so steady when tending to others' injuries, trembled uncontrollably in her lap. Dr. Reynolds had gone straight from the cathedral into surgery with Jack, barely taking time to change into his surgical scrubs. Beth had heard the paramedics' rapid-fire assessment as they rushed through the emergency entrance. Multiple fractures, internal bleeding, possible spinal injury, head trauma. The words had washed over her with terrible familiarity. How many times had she heard similar litanies without truly understanding what they meant to the families waiting beyond the swinging doors? "Beth." A soft voice broke through her stupor. Catherine Reynolds, the doctor's wife, pressed a paper cup of lukewarm coffee into her hands. "Tom's the best there is. If anyone can help Jack, it's him." Beth nodded mechanically, unable to form words. The coffee trembled in her grasp, tiny ripples forming on its surface like the aftershocks of an earthquake. "Have you called?" "Anyone?" Catherine asked gently. "Your parents? Perhaps Robert's family?" The mention of her late husband's name cracked something in Beth's composure. "They're in Arizona," she whispered. I don't want to tell them over the phone that they might lose Jack too." The last words emerged as a broken sob that seemed to rise from the depths of her soul. Catherine wrapped her arms around Beth's shoulders, holding her as the first storm of grief broke loose. Around them, other waiting room occupants averted their eyes, giving what privacy they could in the shared space of anxiety. "He was playing so beautifully," Beth choked out between sobs. "I was so proud. And then... Shh." Catherine soothed, rocking slightly as one would comfort a child. Don't relive it now. Save your strength for when Jack needs you. The surgical waiting room doors swung open, and both women looked up expectantly, but it wasn't Dr. Reynolds who entered. Instead, Reverend Calloway walked in, her clerical collar now partially hidden under a hastily donned cardigan. Her face was ashen, her usual composure fractured by what she had witnessed. "Beth," she said, her voice barely audible as she took the seat opposite. "The entire congregation is praying. I've set up a rotation so someone will be at the cathedral in prayer around the clock until Jack—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Beth straightened, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "Thank you, Sarah. But I have to ask, did you know about Michael Daniels? That he was dangerous?" The question hung in the air between them, laden with accusation and grief. The Reverend's eyes dropped to her clasped hands. "We knew he was troubled," she admitted slowly. "He had been banned twice from the cathedral grounds for erratic behavior. But violent? No. We never saw that in him." She hesitated, then added, "The mental health program might have made a difference if we'd had the resources to continue it." "If you'd had the resources," Beth repeated, a new edge entering her voice. "My husband believed in that program. He donated to it from his military salary, and the first thing you cut when money got tight was help for people like him, Reverend." Calloway's face crumpled. "The board voted. I argued against it, but enough." Catherine's firm interruption surprised both women. "This isn't the time for blame. What matters now is Jack." As if summoned by the mention of his name, the double doors to the surgical wing swung open. Dr. Reynolds emerged, still in his surgical cap and gown, the lower half of his face covered by a mask. His eyes, visible above it, carried the weight of what he had seen and done over the past 6 hours. Beth stood on unsteady legs, reading every line of fatigue in her colleague's posture for clues. "Tom, please." Dr. Reynolds pulled his mask down, revealing a face drawn with exhaustion. For a terrible moment, he seemed unable to speak, and Beth felt her world tilting toward an abyss of unimaginable loss. "He's alive," the doctor finally said. But Beth, it was close. So close. A sound escaped Beth, half sob, half prayer, as her knees threatened to buckle. Catherine was at her side instantly, guiding her back to her chair. "His injuries are extensive," Dr. Reynolds continued, taking the seat across from Beth and leaning forward, his elbows on his knees. It was a posture Beth had seen him use with patients' families, intimate, honest, leaving no professional distance. Multiple fractures in both legs and his right arm, internal bleeding that we've managed to control, and a skull fracture. That's causing pressure on his brain. Beth absorbed each word like a physical blow. "Will he recover?" Dr. Reynolds passed a hand over his face. "During the surgery, we lost him, Beth. For nearly 4 minutes, his heart stopped beating. We got him back, but until he wakes up, if he wakes up, we won't know the extent of the damage. If he wakes up." The words carved themselves into Beth's consciousness. "There's something else," Dr. Reynolds continued, his voice taking on a different tone. "Something I can't quite explain. Jack has an unusual bone density pattern. It's not osteoporosis, more like a selective flexibility in certain bone structures. I've never seen anything quite like it." Beth blinked, momentarily pulled from her grief by professional curiosity. "What does that mean?" "It means," Dr. Reynolds said slowly, "that injuries that should have been catastrophically fatal were instead merely severe. The way he landed, with his bone structure, Beth, it's as if his body was uniquely designed to survive this specific trauma. I don't use this word lightly, but it's miraculous." A flicker of something like hope kindled in Beth's chest, fragile and wavering. "Can I see him?" Dr. Reynolds nodded. "He's being moved to pediatric ICU. He'll be connected to a lot of equipment, Beth. Prepare yourself." As Beth rose to follow Dr. Reynolds, Reverend Calloway caught her hand. "Beth, the man, Michael Daniels. He's been arrested. The police want to speak with you when you're able." A coldness settled over Beth at the mention of the name. "Not now," she said firmly. Not until I know my son will live. The pediatric ICU was a place of hushed voices and rhythmic beeping. Beth had walked these halls countless times in her professional capacity, but nothing had prepared her for the sight of her own child amid the tangle of tubes and wires. Jack's small body was barely visible beneath the apparatus keeping him alive. His golden hair had been partially shaved to accommodate a pressure monitor protruding from his skull. His face, normally so animated, was slack and swollen beyond recognition. Beth moved to his bedside with the careful steps of someone approaching a precipice. She reached out to touch his hand, the left one, unbandaged, and was shocked by its warmth. Somehow she had expected him to feel cold. "I'm here, Jack," she whispered, leaning close to his ear. "Mommy's here. You're safe now." Behind her, Dr. Reynolds conferred quietly with the ICU staff, his authoritative voice issuing instructions for Jack's care. Beth was vaguely aware of Catherine and Reverend Calloway watching from the doorway, their faces solemn. A young officer arrived. At the ICU entrance, his presence incongruous among the medical personnel, he spoke briefly with Reverend Calloway, who then approached Beth with visible reluctance. "Beth, the officer needs to ask you some questions about the incident," she said softly. "And there's something else. They found Michael Daniels' records. He was a patient at Millfield General 6 months ago. Psychiatric evaluation." Beth froze, her hand still curled around Jack's fingers. Slowly, she turned to face the Reverend, her expression shifting as memories crystallized. "He was my patient," she whispered. "I remember now. He came in delusional, hearing voices. We stabilized him, but there were no psychiatric beds available. Standard protocol was to discharge with a referral to outpatient services." Her voice hardened. "Services like the ones the cathedral cut." Dr. Reynolds had moved closer, listening. "Beth, you couldn't have known." "I should have recognized him," Beth interrupted, a new anguish flooding her features. "When he approached us at the piano, I should have seen the signs and done—" "What?" Dr. Reynolds asked gently. "You're one nurse in an understaffed hospital. The system failed him, and by extension, Jack, not you." Beth turned back to her son, the weight of this new knowledge settling over her like a shroud. "The system," she echoed hollowly. "A system we're all part of." For hours, Beth maintained her vigil at Jack's bedside, speaking to him softly, telling him stories of his father, promising adventures once he recovered. The ICU staff, many of them colleagues who had worked alongside Beth for years, moved around her with gentle efficiency, adjusting monitors, checking vital signs, offering quiet words of encouragement. As night deepened outside the hospital windows, Dr. Reynolds returned to check on Jack's condition. He studied the monitors intently, then performed a brief examination, his experienced hands gentle on Jack's broken body. "There's been no increase in intracranial pressure," he reported. "That's a good sign," Beth nodded, too exhausted for words. She had not slept in over 30 hours, having come directly from her night shift to the cathedral. "Beth, you need rest," Dr. Reynolds said, noting her pallor. "Catherine can stay with Jack if you want to use the on-call room." "I'm not leaving him," Beth said with quiet finality. Dr. Reynolds sighed, recognizing the immovable determination of a mother's love. "Then at least eat something. I'll have a cot brought in." As he turned to leave, Beth called after him. "Tom, thank you for saving him." The doctor paused, his shoulders slumping slightly. 20 years ago, I couldn't save my son, Beth. The gang members who shot him were disturbed young men, let down by every social system. I couldn't help thinking today, as I worked on Jack, that nothing has changed. We're still failing the vulnerable among us, and innocents are still paying the price. With those words hanging in the air, he left Beth alone with the steady beeping of the machines keeping her son alive, and the newly awakened knowledge that the tragedy had roots far deeper than a single disturbed man's actions. April turned to May, and May surrendered to June, as Jack Wittmann remained in Millfield General's pediatric ICU. The initial crisis had passed, the surgeries to repair his shattered bones, the careful monitoring of brain pressure, the constant vigilance against infection. But recovery proved to be a marathon rather than a sprint. For Beth, the hospital became a second home, its rhythms and routines as familiar as her own heartbeat. She had not left Jack's side for the first week, sleeping on a cot beside his bed, eating whatever food the staff brought her, showering in the staff locker room. When Jack finally opened his eyes on the 8th day, confused, in pain, but alive, Beth had wept with such abandon that the attending nurse had worried she might need sedation herself. "Mommy," Jack had whispered, his voice raw from the breathing tube that had been removed only the day before. "Where am I?" "You're in the hospital, sweetheart," Beth had answered, pressing her lips to his forehead. "You had an accident, but you're going to be okay. An accident." That was how she described it to him in those early days, unable to burden his fragile recovery with the full truth. How do you tell an 8-year-old that a stranger had chosen him at random for violence, that his suffering was the product of a broken man and a broken system? These were questions Beth wrestled with during the long nights of Jack's hospitalization. By the 3rd week, a routine had established itself. Beth worked 3 12-hour shifts at the hospital, arranged strategically so she could be with Jack during her off hours. When she couldn't be there, Catherine Reynolds took her place, reading to Jack from adventure books or simply sitting quietly while he slept, her presence a steady anchor in the storm. It was Catherine who first noticed Jack's nightmares. "He calls out for you," she told Beth one evening during the changing of their vigil, "and sometimes for Robert. But mostly, he cries about falling, about not being able to stop falling." Beth had nodded, her heart heavy. The physical therapist had warned her about the psychological trauma that often accompanied such injuries. "Children are resilient," he had said, "but they need tools to process what's happened to them." The hospital provided a child psychologist, Dr. Melanie Wen, who began to visit Jack 3 times a week. At first, he refused to speak with her, turning his face to the wall whenever she entered his room. But Dr. Wen was patient, bringing simple drawing materials and sitting quietly, sketching pictures of animals until Jack's curiosity overcame his resistance. "He's built a wall around the memory," Dr. Wen explained to Beth after their 4th session. "It's a protective mechanism, and we need to respect it for now, but eventually, he'll need to process what happened." Beth understood psychological defense mechanisms all too well. Hadn't she built her own walls after Robert's death, throwing herself into work, into mothering, into anything that would keep the grief at bay? But walls, she had learned, don't eliminate pain. They only contain it, pressurizing it until something gives way. The financial strain of Jack's hospitalization mounted, despite Beth's health insurance. The co-pays, the specialists not fully covered, the medical equipment they would need at home. It all added up to a sum that made Beth's stomach clench whenever she allowed herself to think about it. She had been dipping into Robert's life insurance money, the fund she had earmarked for Jack's college education. Cheryl from Human Resources approached her one afternoon as Beth was checking Jack's latest lab results at the nurse's station. "Beth, could we talk in my office?" she asked, her professional smile not quite reaching her eyes. Beth followed woodenly, already anticipating the conversation. She had exceeded her allowed family leave. Her colleagues had donated some of their own sick days to her, but hospital policy was hospital policy. "We value everything you do here," Cheryl began, shuffling papers on her desk, "and everyone understands your situation. But we need to discuss your return to full-time status." Beth nodded mechanically. "I've been working 3 shifts a week." "Yes, but your position is full-time. We've been accommodating your need for a reduced schedule, but it's been almost 2 months, and with the nursing shortage..." Cheryl's voice trailed off, her discomfort evident. "I understand," Beth said, her voice hollow. "Jack will be moved to the rehabilitation floor soon. Their visiting hours are more restricted, so I could return to my regular schedule then." Relief flooded Cheryl's features. "That would be wonderful. And Beth, I'm so glad Jack is improving." The platitude rang hollow as Beth made her way back to Jack's room, her mind churning with logistics. Who would sit with Jack during her shifts? Who would be there when he woke from his nightmares? Who would hold his hand during the painful, physical therapy sessions that made him cry out for her? That night, after Jack had fallen asleep, Beth found herself drawn to the hospital chapel. It was a small space on the first floor, non-denominational, with simple stained glass windows that cast colored shadows across the wooden pews. She didn't go there to pray. Her relationship with faith had grown complicated since Robert's death, and even more so since Jack's injury. Instead, she sought the chapel's silence, its removal from the beeping monitors and squeaking shoes of the hospital proper. To her surprise, Reverend Calloway was there, sitting quietly in the front row. The older woman turned at the sound of Beth's entrance, her face softening with recognition. "Beth," she said simply. "Come sit." Beth hesitated, then slid into the pew beside the Reverend. They sat in silence for several minutes, the distant sounds of the hospital creating a muted backdrop to their shared vigil. "I visited Michael Daniels yesterday," Reverend Calloway finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "At the county jail." Beth's hands clenched in her lap, her body stiffening. "Why would you do that?" "Because no one else has," the Reverend answered simply. "His mother, Martha, is too ill to make the journey. And because I believe that, even in our worst moments we remain God's children." Beth turned to face the older woman, anger suddenly flaring hot in her chest. "God's children? He nearly killed my son. Jack may never walk properly again. He has nightmares every night. He's 8 years old and his childhood has been stolen from him." "I know," Sarah said, meeting Beth's gaze steadily. "And Michael knows too. He's on medication now, proper medication. The delusions have receded enough for him to understand what he did." "Is that supposed to comfort me?" Beth asked bitterly. "That he's sorry?" "No," the Reverend answered. "Nothing can comfort what you've lost. But I thought you should know that Martha has been trying to get Michael proper care for years. She showed me the records, dozens of attempts to get him into treatment programs, all denied due to lack of beds or insurance restrictions. Even our program at the cathedral was just a stopgap, never adequate for his needs." Beth looked away, unwilling to let this information penetrate the protective shell of her anger. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're a nurse, Beth. You understand the broken system better than most, and because, beneath your anger, you're still the compassionate woman who chose to help others for a living. That woman might someday find it possible to forgive." Beth stood abruptly. "Forgiveness? You want me to forgive the man who threw my son off a balcony?" "Not now," Sarah said gently. "Maybe not for years, but someday for your own sake as much as for his." Beth left the chapel without another word, her footsteps echoing in the quiet corridor. The Reverend's words followed her like unwelcome shadows all the way back to Jack's room, where she found him awake and crying silently, his face wet with tears. "Another nightmare?" she asked, gathering him carefully into her arms, mindful of the casts and bandages. Jack nodded against her shoulder. "I was falling again, Mom, but this time, nobody caught me." Beth held him tighter, rocking gently. "I've got you now, sweetheart. I've got you." Later that week, Dr. Reynolds called Beth into his office to discuss Jack's transition to the rehabilitation facility. The senior surgeon looked exhausted, the lines in his face deeper than Beth had ever noticed before. "He's making remarkable progress," Dr. Reynolds began, shuffling through Jack's chart. "The latest scans show excellent healing in the bone fractures, and the neurological tests are encouraging. There are some deficits in fine motor control, particularly in the right hand, but with intensive therapy." "Will he play the piano?" "Again?" Beth interrupted, voicing the question that had haunted her since the accident. Dr. Reynolds set down the chart, removing his glasses to rub the bridge of his nose. "Beth, I can't promise that. The damage to the nerves in his right hand was significant. But children his age have extraordinary neuroplasticity. With the right therapy, dedication, so maybe," Beth finished for him. "A definite maybe," he agreed. He hesitated, then added, "There's something else we need to discuss. A new treatment protocol that might benefit Jack." Beth straightened in her chair. "What kind of treatment?" "An experimental nerve regeneration therapy. It's showing promising results in patients with similar injuries. It might help restore function in Jack's right hand more completely than conventional therapy alone." Hope flickered in Beth's chest. "Why haven't you mentioned this?" Before, Dr. Reynolds leaned forward, his expression grave. Because it's not without risks. The treatment involves a series of injections directly into the damaged nerve pathways. It can be painful, and there's a small but significant risk of adverse reactions. And it's expensive, likely not covered by insurance since it's still considered experimental. Beth absorbed this information, her mind racing through calculations she couldn't possibly resolve. How expensive? Approximately $80,000 for the full course of treatment. The figure hit Beth like a physical blow. That's impossible. I don't have that kind of money. I know, Dr. Reynolds said softly. That's why I wanted to discuss it with you privately before presenting it as an option in Jack's case conference. There might be grants, charitable foundations, but no guarantees, Beth finished. No, he agreed. No guarantees. Beth left his office with a heavier heart than when she had entered. Another door closing. Another possibility slipping away because of money. It seemed cruelly fitting. The same financial constraints that had cut the mental health program that might have helped Michael Daniels were now limiting Jack's potential recovery. That evening, a soft knock on Jack's hospital room door roused Beth from her troubled thoughts. Martha Daniels stood in the doorway, a frail woman in her 70s, her white hair pulled back in a simple bun, her hands clutching a small gift bag. Beth instinctively moved to position herself between the visitor and Jack's bed. "Mrs. Daniels," she said, her voice tight with tension. "I don't think—" "Please," Martha interrupted, her voice quavering. "Just 5 minutes. I had to come. Had to see." Beth glanced at Jack, who was watching the exchange with curious eyes. He had been more alert in recent days, more engaged with his surroundings. "Jack needs his rest," she said firmly. "Who is she, Mom?" Jack asked, his voice still weak but clear. Beth hesitated, caught between protection and truth. "This is Mrs. Daniels, sweetheart. She's related to the man who hurt you." Jack's eyes widened slightly, but his expression remained curiously open. "Oh," he said simply. Then to Martha, "Hello." The simple greeting seemed to pierce Martha's composure. She swayed slightly, and Beth instinctively stepped forward to steady her, medical training overriding personal feelings. "You should sit down," Beth said, guiding the older woman to the visitor's chair by the window, away from Jack's bed. "Thank you," Martha whispered. "I won't stay long. She extended the small gift bag toward Beth. "I made this for him. It's nothing much, just a quilt. I've been sewing all my life, and when I can't sleep—" Her voice trailed off. Beth accepted the bag but didn't open it. "Mrs. Daniels, I appreciate the gesture, but I'm not sure this is appropriate." "I understand," Martha said, her eyes filling with tears. "I just wanted you to know how sorry I am, how sorry we both are. Michael, he wasn't always like this. After his 3rd tour, something broke inside him. I tried to get him help for years. I tried." Jack was watching them intently, his young face solemn. "Is your son sick?" he asked suddenly. Martha turned to him, startled by the direct question. "Yes," she said after a moment. "In his mind, he hears voices that aren't real, sees things that aren't there." Jack considered this. "I had a fever once where I saw spiders on the ceiling. Mom said they weren't real, but they looked real to me." "Jack, sweetheart," Beth began, alarmed by the direction of the conversation. "It's a bit like that," Martha said gently, "except the fever never goes away without the right medicine, and sometimes it's hard to get that medicine." Jack nodded, accepting this explanation with the straightforward logic of childhood. "I hope he gets better," he said simply. Martha covered her mouth with a trembling hand, tears spilling onto her cheeks. Beth found herself unexpectedly moved as well, Jack's innocent compassion throwing her own tangled emotions into sharp relief. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Daniels," Beth said, softening her tone slightly. "But Jack does need his rest now." Martha nodded, rising unsteadily to her feet. "Of course. Thank you for seeing me." She paused at the door. "My son will plead guilty, you know." He doesn't want a trial. He told me he remembers enough to know what he did, and he wants to take responsibility. After she had gone, Beth sank into the chair she had vacated, suddenly exhausted. The gift bag sat untouched in her lap. "Aren't you going to open it, Mom?" Jack asked. Beth looked at her son, her miracle, her survivor, and saw not just physical recovery in his eyes, but a wisdom beyond his years. Wordlessly, she opened the bag and pulled out a small, exquisitely crafted quilt. It was a simple pattern of stars against a deep blue background, with Jack's name embroidered in one corner. "It's pretty," Jack said, reaching out his left hand to touch the soft fabric. "Yes," Beth agreed quietly. "It is, Miss Daniela." That night, after Jack had fallen asleep, Beth unfolded the quilt and laid it across the foot of his bed. It was an offering, a plea for forgiveness, a fragment of beauty created from the depths of another mother's pain. Beth wasn't ready to forgive, wasn't sure she ever would be. But as she watched her son sleeping peacefully beneath the hand-sewn stars, she felt something inside her shift ever so slightly. A crack in the wall she had built around her heart since that terrible day at Liberty Heights Cathedral. Outside, summer rain began to fall, pattering against the hospital windows like gentle applause for the small, fragile peace that had taken root in room 412 of Millfield General's pediatric ward. 4 months after the fall, Jack Wittmann came home. The rehabilitation hospital had released him with a regimen of outpatient therapy 3 times a week, a wheelchair for longer distances, and a walker for practicing the tentative steps his recovering body could manage. The homecoming should have been triumphant, a celebration of survival against impossible odds. Instead, it arrived weighted with uncertainty, a beginning rather than an end. Beth had spent the week before his discharge transforming their small ranch house to accommodate Jack's new needs. The coffee table had been removed to create a pathway for the walker. The shower had been fitted with grab bars and a seat. Jack's bed had been moved to the den, eliminating the need to navigate stairs. Each modification was both practical and painful, concrete reminders of how their lives had changed. "Welcome home, sweetheart," Beth said as she wheeled Jack up the ramp Robert's old Army buddies had built over the front steps the previous weekend. Their kindness had moved her to tears. Men who had their own burdens, their own losses, showing up with lumber and tools because Robert would have done the same for them. Jack had been quiet during the drive from the hospital, his face pressed against the passenger window, watching the familiar streets of Millfield with solemn eyes. Now as the front door opened, he smiled for the first time that day, a tentative curve of lips that didn't quite reach his eyes, but was progress nonetheless. "Can I try walking in?" he asked, his voice stronger than it had been in the early weeks but still bearing the faint rasp from intubation. Beth hesitated. Dr. Leeds, the rehabilitation specialist, had warned against overtaxing Jack's recovering body, but she also recognized the psychological importance of this moment. Crossing his own threshold on his own terms. "Of course," she said, retrieving the walker from the trunk. "Just take it slow." It took nearly 10 minutes for Jack to navigate the ramp and cross the threshold, each step a study in determination and pain. Beth stayed beside him, her hands hovering near his shoulders without touching, allowing him the dignity of his struggle while remaining ready to catch him if needed. By the time he reached the sofa, sweat beaded his forehead and his breath came in shallow pants. "I did it," he whispered as she helped him settle into the cushions. "You did," Beth confirmed, her throat tight with pride and grief. "You're the bravest person I know, Jack Wittmann." That evening, Catherine Reynolds arrived with a casserole and news. She settled at the kitchen table while Beth made coffee, her elegant hands fidgeting with a napkin, a rare display of nerves from the usually composed doctor's wife. "The sentencing hearing is scheduled for next week," she said, without preamble. "Tom thought you should know. The DA says with Michael's guilty plea, it should be straightforward." Beth's hands stilled on the coffee mugs. "Will I need to be there?" "They've asked if you want to make a victim impact statement. It could influence the judge's decision on sentencing." Beth carried the mugs to the table, buying time to organize her thoughts. "What is the DA recommending?" 20 years, Catherine said quietly. Attempted murder of a child carries substantial penalties in this state. 20 years. The number hung in the air between them. Jack would be 28 when Michael Daniels completed his sentence. A grown man, his childhood and adolescence long behind him. Martha Daniels called me yesterday, Beth said, surprising herself with the admission. She wanted to know how Jack was doing, if there was anything she could do to help. Catherine nodded, unsurprised. She's a good woman, caught in a terrible situation. Tom says she's been bringing homemade food to the hospital staff. On the psych unit for years, even when Michael wasn't a patient there, she understands the burden they carry. She asked if I would consider meeting with her before the sentencing to talk. Beth ran a finger around the rim of her coffee mug, her gaze fixed on the dark liquid. I told her I'd think about it. What will you say at the hearing? Catherine asked gently. If you decide to speak. Beth looked toward the den, where Jack had fallen asleep on his new bed, exhausted from the day's exertions. I don't know, she admitted. Part of me wants to demand the maximum sentence, to see him punished for every second of pain Jack has endured, and another part understands that punishing Michael doesn't fix the larger broken system. Catherine finished for her. Exactly, Beth sighed, suddenly bone-weary. And it doesn't undo what happened to Jack. Nothing does. The next morning dawned clear and warm, a perfect June day. Beth had taken family medical leave from the hospital, unpaid but necessary, to help Jack settle in at home. They established a routine: morning exercises as prescribed by the physical therapist, followed by breakfast, then homeschooling materials provided by Jack's second-grade teacher for the classes he had missed. Afternoons were for rest and quieter activities, reading, drawing, or watching the nature documentaries Jack had recently become fascinated with. It was during one of these documentary sessions that Jack asked the question Beth had been dreading. "Mom," he said, his eyes still fixed on the television where sea turtles were hatching from eggs, "will I ever play piano again?" Beth muted the TV and moved to sit beside him on the sofa. "The doctors think you might be able to, with lots of therapy. Your left hand is already getting stronger. The right one, that might take more time." Jack looked down at his right hand, which still trembled with fine tremors when he tried to use it for precise movements. "Because of the nerve damage," he said. It wasn't a question. He'd been present for enough medical discussions to understand his own injuries with the unnerving clarity of a child who had grown up too fast. "Yes," Beth confirmed. "But there are treatments that might help. Special exercises, maybe even a new therapy Dr. Reynolds told us about. The expensive one," Jack said, again with that disconcerting awareness. Beth fought back a surge of anger, not at Jack, but at a world where an 8-year-old had to understand medical economics. "We'll figure something out," she promised, though she had no idea how. Jack was quiet for a moment, then said, "I'm not scared of him anymore." "Who, sweetheart?" "The man who hurt me. I was scared before, but I'm not now." Beth struggled to keep her expression neutral. "Why not?" Jack shrugged, the movement still careful to avoid jarring his healing collarbone. "Because he's sick, like Mrs. Daniels said, like how Grandpa got confused before he died, remember? He called me Robert once." "That was different," Beth began, but Jack continued as if he hadn't heard. "And because I'm getting better. Doctor Wen says we're stronger than the bad things that happen to us." Beth drew in a shaky breath, wondering when her son had become wiser than she was. "Dr. Wen is very smart." Jack nodded solemnly. "She says it's okay to be angry too." "Are you angry, Mom?" The question pierced Beth's carefully maintained composure. "Yes," she admitted quietly. "Sometimes I'm very angry. At the man, yes. And at other things too." Jack seemed to accept this answer, turning his attention back to the sea turtles making their perilous journey to the ocean. Beth sat beside him, her thoughts churning with the conversation they'd just had and the decision she needed to make about the sentencing hearing. The next day, she called Martha Daniels. They met at a small coffee shop halfway between their homes, a neutral ground that was neither the Wittmann house nor the Daniels residence. Martha arrived early, already seated at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee when Beth walked in. The older woman stood as Beth approached, her movement stiff with arthritis and anxiety. "Thank you for coming," Martha said, her voice thin with emotion. "I wasn't sure you would." Beth took the seat across from her, noting the deep circles beneath Martha's eyes, the slight tremor in her hands that matched Jack's but for very different reasons. "I'm not sure why I'm here either," she admitted. "How is Jack doing?" Martha asked, pushing one of the coffee cups toward Beth. "Better than the doctors expected," Beth replied, wrapping her hands around the warm mug, but not drinking. "He's home now, starting to walk short distances with a walker." Martha nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "He seems like a remarkable boy from the little I saw of him." "He is," Beth agreed, a mother's pride momentarily overshadowing everything else. "He's handling this with more grace than I am, to be honest." "Children often do," Martha said softly. "They haven't learned all our adult ways of holding on to pain." The observation, so similar to Beth's own thoughts the previous day, created an unexpected moment of connection between the two women. For a beat, they were simply mothers, sharing the universal experience of being humbled by their children's resilience. "The sentencing is next week," Beth said, breaking the fragile moment. "I haven't decided what I'm going to say." Martha nodded, her gaze dropping to her coffee. "Michael doesn't want me there. He says it would be too painful for both of us. He's accepting whatever sentence the judge gives. 20 years is a long time," Beth said, surprising herself with the observation. "Yes," Martha agreed, "but not as long as a lifetime of disability would be for Jack if things had gone differently, not as long as grief would be if he had died." The stark assessment, delivered without self-pity, struck Beth with its honesty. This woman was not making excuses for her son's actions, not seeking to minimize the harm he had caused. "I brought something," Martha said, reaching into her worn handbag. She withdrew a thick manila envelope and placed it on the table between them. "These are Michael's medical records, his discharge papers from the Army, the documentation of all the times I tried to get him proper care. I thought you might want to see them before you decide what to say at the sentencing." Beth stared at the envelope, making no move to take it. "Why would I want those?" "Because you're a nurse," Martha said simply. "Because you understand the system better than most people, and because whatever you decide to say will carry weight with the judge. I'm not asking for leniency for Michael. God knows he needs to face consequences for what he did. But perhaps there's a way his case could shine a light on the larger failures that led to that terrible day." Beth looked into Martha's eyes and saw not a mother trying to excuse her son's violence, but a woman who had been fighting a losing battle against a broken system for years, a woman who, even in her grief and shame, was still trying to prevent other families from experiencing the same tragedy. "I'll read them," Beth said finally, picking up the envelope. "I can't promise anything else. That's all I can ask," Martha replied, relief softening the deeply etched lines of her face. "Thank you." As they parted outside the coffee shop, Martha hesitated, then said, "Whatever you decide, please know that I pray for Jack every day for his complete healing." Beth nodded, unable to form a response around the sudden tightness in her throat. She watched Martha walk slowly to her car, the older woman's shoulders bent beneath an invisible weight that would never fully lift. There was no victory here, Beth realized. No clear villains or heroes, just broken people trying to find their way through the aftermath of tragedy. That night, after Jack was asleep, Beth opened the manila envelope and began to read. The January sky hung low and gray over Millfield as Dr. Reynolds helped Beth guide Jack's wheelchair up the icy walkway to the hospital entrance. 6 months had passed since Jack's homecoming, and while his progress had been steady, today marked a significant setback, a scheduled surgery to address unexpected complications in his right leg. "The bone isn't healing properly, Dr. Reynolds had explained during their last appointment, his finger tracing the shadow on the X-ray that indicated the problem. "It's not uncommon with injuries this severe. We need to go in and place additional hardware to stabilize the femur before it creates long-term mobility issues. Jack had taken the news with the stoic acceptance that still unnerved Beth. A child his age should rage against unfairness, should protest additional pain. Instead, he had simply asked, "Will I still start school next month?" Now, as they approached the familiar sliding doors of Millfield General, Jack looked up at his mother. "It's just a small surgery, right, Mom? Not like before." Beth squeezed his shoulder gently. "That's right, sweetheart. You'll be in and out much faster this time." Dr. Reynolds leaned down to meet Jack at eye level, a gesture of respect he always showed his youngest patients. "And remember our deal. When you're fully recovered, we're going to see about those piano lessons with Mrs. Reynolds. She's been saving her best beginner pieces for you." Jack's face brightened momentarily at the mention of music, though his enthusiasm dimmed as they entered the hospital, the antiseptic smell triggering memories that still haunted his dreams. The day's events unfolded with the mechanical precision of medical routine, the admission paperwork, the preparations, the gentle explanations from the surgical team. Beth maintained her composure throughout, having learned over the past months to save her tears for private moments. Only when they wheeled Jack away, his small face obscured by the surgical cap, did she allow her shoulders to slump. "He'll be fine," Dr. Reynolds assured her, guiding her to the surgical waiting room. "I've got my best orthopedic surgeon on this. 3 hours tops." Beth nodded, sinking into the now familiar molded plastic chair. "I know. It's just, I thought we were past this part. The surgeries, the recoveries, I thought we were moving forward." Dr. Reynolds sat beside her, his white coat creased from a long shift. "Recovery isn't linear, Beth. You know that better than most. There are setbacks along the way, but the overall trajectory is still upward." "Is it?" Beth asked, the question escaping before she could contain it. "Jack still has nightmares almost every night. His right hand still trembles when he tries to hold a pencil. And now this." She gestured toward the surgical doors. "Sometimes it feels like we're just treading water, waiting for the next wave to hit." Dr. Reynolds was quiet for a moment, his lined face thoughtful. "When my son died," he said finally, "I thought the pain would kill me too. Every morning, I woke up and remembered all over again that he was gone. And every morning, it felt like a fresh wound." He paused, his gaze distant. 20 years later, I still have those mornings sometimes, but they come less frequently now. The pain changes shape. It becomes something you carry rather than something that drags you under." Beth studied the older man's face, seeing for the first time the full depth of his loss etched in the lines around his eyes. "Does it ever get easier?" she asked softly. "Not easier," he replied. "Different. You build your life around the empty space, find meaning in the void." He smiled slightly. "That's why I fought so hard for Jack in those first hours. I couldn't save my son, but maybe I could help save yours." The simple confession broke something open in Beth. "I lost my job yesterday," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Official termination notice. Position eliminated due to departmental restructuring. That's what the letter said. But we all know the real reason. Too many absences. Too many schedule accommodations." Dr. Reynolds' expression darkened. "The hospital did this? After everything you've been through? After 15 years of service?" Beth laughed, a brittle sound without humor. "It's business, Tom. The nursing shortage doesn't extend to nurses who can't work nights or weekends because they're caring for injured children." "This is unconscionable," Dr. Reynolds said, rising to his feet. "I'll speak to the board. I have some influence." "No," Beth interrupted firmly. "I don't want special treatment. That's part of what got me here in the first place." She sighed, suddenly exhausted. "Besides, it doesn't matter now. Jack's medical bills have already wiped out my savings. I'm 3 months behind on the mortgage, another surgery, another round of rehabilitation." She trailed off, the arithmetic of disaster too overwhelming to complete. Dr. Reynolds sat back down, his expression grave. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" Beth shrugged, a gesture of defeat she wouldn't have allowed herself 6 months ago. "Pride? Denial? Take your pick. I kept thinking something would change, that the insurance would come through, that the hospital would understand. She smiled sadly. That things would get easier, like you said. Different, he corrected gently. Not easier. And sometimes different means accepting help. Before Beth could respond, the doors to the surgical suite opened. She rose automatically, expecting to see the surgeon with an update, but instead found Reverend Calloway standing in the waiting room entrance, her silver hair dusted with snowflakes. From outside. I came as soon as Catherine called me, the Reverend said, crossing to embrace Beth. How is he? Still in surgery, Beth answered, surprised and oddly touched by the older woman's presence. Their relationship had been strained since the day of the fall, weighted by unspoken blame and grief. It should be another hour or so, Reverend. Calloway nodded, removing her coat and settling into a chair. Then I'll wait with you. Dr. Reynolds excused himself to check on another patient, leaving the two women alone in the quiet waiting room. The silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the muted hospital announcements over the PA system. The church voted last night on the proposed mental health center, Reverend Calloway said finally. It was defeated by 3 votes. Beth looked up sharply. After everything that happened? After Jack? The Reverend nodded, her disappointment evident. Fear is a powerful motivator, Beth. Some members worry that offering services will attract more troubled individuals to the area. Others are concerned about liability issues. She sighed heavily. In the end, it came down to money. The program would require a substantial commitment of resources the church isn't willing to make. Even though those resources might have prevented what happened to Jack, Beth said, bitterness seeping into her voice. Even though, Reverend Calloway agreed quietly. I argued that point quite forcefully, I assure you, but fear and self-interest won the day. She leaned forward, her lined face earnest. I wanted you to hear it from me rather than through the rumor mill, and to know that some of us haven't given up. We're looking for alternative funding, other venues. Beth nodded, too drained by the day's events to summon outrage. Thank you for telling me, and for coming today. There's something else, the Reverend continued hesitantly. Martha Daniels suffered a stroke 3 days ago. She's at County General in the ICU. Beth's breath caught. Despite their complex connection, she had grown to respect the older woman over the past months. Their coffee shop meeting had led to occasional phone calls. Brief conversations centered mostly around Jack's progress, but sometimes touching on deeper waters. Is she going to recover? The prognosis is uncertain, Reverend Calloway replied. She's stabilized, but there's significant damage. She was alone when it happened. A neighbor found her nearly 12 hours later. Does Michael know? Yes. The prison chaplain informed him. But of course he can't visit her. The Reverend paused, then added softly. She's been asking for you, in her more lucid moments. Beth closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the collision of crises, Jack's surgery, her job loss, Martha's stroke. It was too much. A perfect storm of calamity that threatened to sweep away what remained of her strength. I can't, she whispered. Not now. Not with everything else. I understand, Reverend Calloway said gently. No one would expect you to, Mrs. Wittmann. A surgeon in blue scrubs stood in the doorway, his face unreadable behind his mask. Could you come with me, please? There's been a complication during Jack's procedure. Beth felt the floor tilt beneath her, darkness encroaching at the edges of her vision. The Reverend caught her arm, steadying her as she rose on legs suddenly made of water. What kind of complication? She managed to ask, her voice strange, to her own ears. We'll discuss it privately, the surgeon replied, his eyes revealing nothing above his mask. Please come with me. As Beth followed him through the swinging doors, she felt herself standing at the edge of an abyss, darker and deeper than anything she had faced before. Not even Robert's death had prepared her for this moment, this terrible threshold beyond which might lie the unthinkable. Behind her she heard Reverend Calloway's voice, soft but clear in the sterile corridor. I'll be praying, Beth. For the first time since her son's fall, Beth found herself silently echoing the sentiment, calling out to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore, begging for mercy she wasn't sure she deserved. The complication during Jack's surgery turned out to be a blessing in disguise. When the orthopedic team opened his right leg to place the additional hardware, they discovered something unexpected. The bone was actually healing, but in an unusual pattern that had confused the imaging. Instead of requiring more metal and screws, Jack needed less. The surgeon had removed some of the original hardware, allowing the bone to complete its natural healing process. "It's quite remarkable," Dr. Reynolds explained to Beth in the recovery room, where Jack slept peacefully under the influence of anesthesia. "His body is demonstrating exceptional healing capacity. The surgeon said he's rarely seen anything like it in a trauma case this severe." Relief had washed over Beth in dizzying waves. After months of setbacks and struggle, this small victory felt monumental. She had sat beside Jack's bed while he slept, holding his limp hand, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest, and allowed herself to imagine a future where surgeries and hospitals were occasional events rather than the center of their lives. But the emotional high of that moment proved short-lived. The following morning, as Jack was being discharged with a far better prognosis than expected, Beth received a call from the bank. Her mortgage forbearance period had ended, and without immediate payment, foreclosure proceedings would begin within 30 days. "Is there anything else we can do?" she asked the unsympathetic voice on the phone. "A payment plan, perhaps? I'm expecting an insurance settlement soon." The last part was a lie. The insurance company had denied her appeal for the experimental nerve therapy weeks ago. But desperation made her reckless. "I'm afraid we've exhausted all available options, Mrs. Wittmann," the bank representative replied. "You've already received the maximum extensions allowed under our hardship program." Beth ended the call and sank onto the edge of Jack's hospital bed, where he was sitting, fully dressed, eager to go home. His face, still thin but brighter than it had been in months, clouded with concern. "What's wrong, Mom?" Beth forced a smile. "Nothing important, sweetheart. Just grown-up stuff. Are you ready to blow this popsicle stand?" Jack nodded, but his eyes, so like Robert's, remained troubled. At 9 years old now, having celebrated a birthday in the midst of recovery, he had developed an uncanny ability to sense her distress. The drive home was quiet, Jack dozing in, the passenger seat from the lingering effects of anesthesia, Beth's mind racing through increasingly desperate calculations. With no income beyond Robert's military pension, the medical bills mounting despite insurance, and now the mortgage crisis, the math was implacable. They were going to lose their home. As Beth pulled into the driveway, she noticed an unfamiliar car parked at the curb, a sleek silver sedan that screamed expense account. A woman in a tailored suit stood on the front porch, a leather portfolio tucked under one arm. Beth's stomach clenched. Had the bank already sent someone? Were things moving that quickly? "Wait here," she told the half-awake Jack, setting the parking brake. "I'll just be a minute." The woman turned as Beth approached, extending a manicured hand. "Mrs. Wittmann, I'm Elaine Hargrove from the Collins Foundation. I was hoping to speak with you about your son." Beth shook the offered hand automatically, her mind struggling to place the name. "The Collins Foundation? We're a non-profit organization that funds innovative medical treatments for children with traumatic injuries," Ms. Hargrove explained, her voice warm but professional. "Dr. Reynolds submitted an application on Jack's behalf for our grant program. I'm here to discuss the details with you, if you have a moment." It took several seconds for the words to register through Beth's exhaustion. "Dr. Reynolds applied for a grant? For Jack?" Ms. Hargrove nodded, her gaze shifting to the car where Jack was now watching them curiously through the window. "For the experimental nerve regeneration therapy. Our medical advisory board was quite impressed with his case. The potential for recovery, given his age and unique healing patterns, is exceptional." Beth glanced back at her son, then at the impeccably dressed woman on her porch. Hope, that treacherous emotion she had tried so hard to keep at bay, fluttered in her chest. "Please come in. Jack's just had a minor procedure, but he's doing well." Inside, over coffee that Beth's trembling hands nearly spilled, Ms. Hargrove explained the parameters of the grant. The Collins Foundation would cover the full cost of the experimental therapy, all $80,000, plus associated rehabilitation costs. In return, they required regular documentation of Jack's progress for their research database. We believe his case could provide valuable insights for other children with similar injuries, Ms. Hargrove said, watching Jack as he sat quietly by the window, leafing through a book. Particularly the relationship between nerve regeneration and musical ability. Jack looked up at the mention of music. "Will I be able to play piano again?" he asked directly, his young voice steady. Ms. Hargrove's professional demeanor softened. "That's our hope, Jack. The treatment has shown promising results in restoring fine motor skills, but it will take time and a lot of hard work on your part." "I don't mind working hard," Jack said with the simple conviction of childhood. "I want to play music again." Later, after Ms. Hargrove had left with signed paperwork and promises to arrange the first treatment session within 2 weeks, Beth sat on the edge of Jack's bed while he drifted toward sleep. His room, the converted den, was painted in soft blues and greens, the walls adorned with his recent artistic efforts. Drawing had become a form of therapy for him, a way to express what words couldn't capture about his experience. "Mom," he murmured, already half asleep. "Is our luck changing?" Beth smoothed his hair back from his forehead, noting how it had darkened slightly over the past year, becoming more like Robert's chestnut brown. "Maybe it is, sweetheart. Maybe it is." But even as she spoke the reassuring words, Beth knew that financial relief from the medical bills was only one piece of their complicated puzzle. The mortgage remained in jeopardy, her career lay in ruins, and the emotional wounds, Jack's ongoing nightmares, her own tangle of grief and rage, still festered beneath the surface of their daily lives. The following morning, Beth drove to County General to visit Martha Daniels. The decision had come to her during the night, rising from some deep place of gratitude and compassion, awakened by the unexpected gift from the Collins Foundation. If her own fortunes could turn so suddenly, perhaps there was hope for others, caught in tragedy's web as well. Martha's room in the ICU was dim and quiet, save for the mechanical hum and beep of monitoring equipment. The once vibrant woman lay small and gray against the white sheets, a tube disappearing into her mouth, one side of her face noticeably drooping. A nurse Beth didn't recognize looked up from charting vital signs. "Are you family?" she asked, professional suspicion in her tone. "A friend," Beth replied, surprising herself with the truth of the word. "How is she doing?" The nurse, Diane according to her badge, softened slightly. "There's been little change since admission. The stroke affected the left side of her brain. She has periods of consciousness but can't speak because of the ventilator." Beth nodded, familiar with the clinical realities. "May I sit with her for a while?" "Of course. Talk to her if you'd like. We believe patients can hear, even when they can't respond." Left alone with Martha, Beth settled into the visitor's chair and studied the woman who had raised Michael Daniels. In sleep or unconsciousness, Martha's face showed none of the strain and sorrow that had marked their previous meetings. She looked peaceful, almost serene. "Hello, Martha," Beth said softly. "It's Beth Wittmann, Jack's mother." The introduction felt strange but necessary. "I heard about your stroke. I'm sorry I couldn't come sooner." Martha remained motionless, save for the mechanically induced rise and fall of her chest. Beth continued anyway, finding unexpected relief in speaking the thoughts she had kept buttoned up for so long. "Jack is doing better. Much better, actually. There's a foundation that's going to pay for a special treatment for his hand. He might be able to play piano again someday." She paused, watching Martha's face for any sign of awareness. "I think you'd be happy about that. You seem like someone who understands the importance of music." A slight flutter of Martha's eyelids might have been a response or merely reflex. Beth pressed on, the words flowing more easily now. "I read Michael's records, the ones you gave me. I saw the letters from the VA denying treatment, the referrals to programs with 2-year waiting lists, the emergency room visits when he was in crisis." She swallowed hard. "I saw your desperate notes in the margins, the phone numbers called again and again." Beth reached out tentatively, then covered Martha's limp hand with her own. "I spoke at Michael's sentencing hearing yesterday. I don't know if anyone's told you. The DA wanted 20 years. The judge was inclined to agree." She recalled standing in the courtroom, Michael Daniels in his orange jumpsuit at the defense table, his posture defeated, his face hollow with medication and remorse. She remembered the hush that had fallen as she approached the podium, the weight of expectation from the prosecutors who assumed she would demand the maximum penalty. "I told them about Jack's injuries, about his nightmares and his pain, about the long road he still has ahead." Beth's voice faltered slightly. "But I also told them about you, Martha, about your fight to get Michael help. I showed them the records of all the times the system failed both of you." The ventilator continued its rhythmic work, the only response to Beth's confession. Outside the ICU room, hospital staff moved on quiet feet, the normal business of healing continuing uninterrupted. I asked the judge to consider a different kind of sentence, one that would include mandatory psychiatric treatment, not just warehousing in a prison cell. I said that punishing Michael wouldn't fix what happened to Jack, but maybe preventing others like him from falling through the cracks could create something meaningful from our shared tragedy. Beth felt the sting of tears, but didn't bother to wipe them away. The judge sentenced him to 12 years instead of 20, with eligibility for transfer to a secure psychiatric facility after 5 if he demonstrates progress. It's not perfect, but it's something. Martha's fingers twitched slightly beneath Beth's hand, a definite movement this time, however small. Beth looked up to find the older woman's eyes open, glistening with tears that leaked slowly down her slack cheeks. Though she couldn't speak around the ventilator tube, her gaze conveyed a depth of gratitude that words would have struggled to express. "Jack drew something for you," Beth continued, reaching into her purse to withdraw. A carefully folded piece of paper. She opened it to reveal a child's drawing of a woman tending a garden full of vibrant flowers. Above the figure, written in Jack's improving handwriting, were the words, "Get well soon, Mrs. Daniels." Beth propped the drawing on the bedside table, where Martha could see it. "He's never met you properly, but he remembers you from the hospital. He knows you make quilts and like to garden. I hope that's right." Martha's eyes remained fixed on the drawing, more tears tracking silently down her face. Beth sat with her a while longer, sometimes speaking of inconsequential things, the weather, the spring flowers beginning to bloom, Jack's growing collection of nature documentaries, and sometimes simply sharing the comfortable silence of two women united by circumstances neither would have chosen, but both were determined to navigate, with grace. As visiting hours came to an end, Beth stood to leave, gathering her purse and jacket. At the door, she turned back for one last look at Martha, who watched her from the bed with eyes that seemed more alert than when she had arrived. "I'll come again tomorrow," Beth promised. "And when you're better, maybe we can talk about that mental health center that the church doesn't want to build. I have some ideas about that." April 2025 dawned with the soft pastels of spring, cherry blossoms dotting the grounds of Liberty Heights Cathedral like pink snow. 6 years had passed since Jack Wittmann's fall, years marked by struggle and triumph, setbacks and healing, grief and unexpected joy. The cathedral's central atrium, once the site of unimaginable trauma, had been transformed for today's celebration, its soaring space filled with music and light. The marble floors gleamed beneath temporary staging, where a grand piano stood in silent promise. Rows of chairs faced the makeshift stage, filling quickly as Millfield's residents arrived in their Sunday best. At the entrance, a simple bronze plaque announced the Wittmann Center for Mental Health and Healing, because every life deserves care. Beth Wittmann stood at the periphery, watching the gathering with quiet amazement. At 40, her face had acquired new lines of character, laughter creases framing her eyes, a furrow of determination between her brows. But the shadows of exhaustion that had marked her for so long had finally receded. Her navy dress was simple, but elegant, a concession to the importance of the day. Nervous? Catherine Reynolds appeared at her side, elegant as always in pale gray, her silver hair swept into a graceful chignon. Beth smiled, linking arms with her friend, terrified, but the good kind, I think. Catherine nodded, her understanding evident. Tom is too. He's changed his tie 3 times this morning. Dr. Reynolds had emerged from retirement for this day, his expertise and reputation lending crucial credibility to the ambitious project. The past 3 years had seen him working tirelessly alongside Beth to secure funding, design programs, and navigate the labyrinthine bureaucracy of mental health services. Today marked the culmination of their shared vision, and a personal victory neither had dared imagine during those dark days in Millfield General's ICU. "Is Martha here yet?" Beth asked, scanning the crowd. "Just arrived. Her daughter is helping her find a seat near the front." Martha Daniels had survived her stroke, though recovery had been slow and partial. The right side of her body remained weakened, her speech sometimes halting, but her mind stayed sharp as ever. After 2 years in a rehabilitation facility, she had moved in with her daughter in Millfield, where she continued to make her exquisite quilts, though now with just one fully functional hand. Beth's gaze shifted to the front row, where Jack sat with Martha, his 14-year-old frame lanky in his first proper suit. He leaned toward the older woman, listening intently to something she was saying, his expression animated. The sight still struck Beth with wonder, this miracle of connection that had blossomed from tragedy's bitter soil. The experimental nerve therapy had worked better than anyone dared hope. After 18 months of painful injections and grueling rehabilitation, Jack had regained nearly 80% function in his right hand. The tremors never completely disappeared. They became more pronounced when he was tired or stressed. But they no longer defined his capabilities. Piano had become both therapy and passion, his dedication to relearning the instrument evolving into a genuine gift. Today marked his first public performance since the fall, a milestone that left Beth breathless with pride and anxiety in equal measure. "It's time," Reverend Calloway approached, dressed in her formal clerical robes for the occasion. At a Fido 67, she moved more slowly than she once had, but her eyes retained their keen intelligence and compassion. "Are you ready?" Beth nodded, smoothing her dress with suddenly damp palms. "As I'll ever be." The 3 women made their way to the stage, where Dr. Reynolds already stood at the podium, his distinguished presence commanding attention as the crowd settled. The cathedral fell quiet as he began to speak, his resonant voice carrying to the farthest corners without need of amplification. 6 years ago, a terrible act of violence occurred in this very space, he began, his gaze sweeping the assembled faces. A young boy fell, a mother's heart broke, and a community was left to grapple with questions that had no easy answers. Why did this happen? How could it have been prevented? And perhaps most importantly, what now? Beth listened as he recounted the journey from that day to this, the formation of a community task force, the fundraising campaign that had ultimately secured nearly $2 million in donations and grants, the partnerships forged with medical institutions and social service agencies. He spoke of failures and frustrations, of bureaucratic roadblocks and skeptical officials, of moments when the dream seemed impossible. But today, he concluded, his voice thickening with emotion, we stand together in the very place where tragedy struck to declare that healing is possible, that broken systems can be mended, that communities can rise to meet the needs of their most vulnerable members. As applause filled the cathedral, Beth rose to take his place at the podium. The speech she had rehearsed for weeks now seemed inadequate, clinical in the face of the emotion swelling in her chest. She abandoned her prepared remarks and spoke instead from the heart. "When my son fell, I thought our lives were over," she said simply. In many ways they were. The life we had known ended that day. But what I've learned since is that endings can also be beginnings. She described the journey through grief and rage, the temptation of bitterness, the unexpected lessons in forgiveness. She spoke of Martha Daniels' courage in facing her son's actions, of Dr. Reynolds' wisdom in channeling his own decades-old loss into healing for others, of Reverend Calloway's persistence in pursuing justice alongside mercy. "This center won't solve every problem," Beth acknowledged. "It won't heal every broken mind or prevent every tragedy, but it offers something precious, a place to begin, a hand extended, a door opened." As she stepped away from the podium, Jack rose from his seat and made his way to the piano. The slight limp in his right leg was barely noticeable now, a ghost of the injuries that had once threatened to confine him to a wheelchair. He settled, on the bench, adjusting it with practiced ease, then looked out at the audience with a confidence that brought tears to Beth's eyes.